Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm Mark Mandel, and I'm so glad that you're with us today for our first coffee break webinar. Today's call is in a new, different format for us. Rather than try to force what might be too much content into a long call that might not fit into your workday, we decided to set up a series of calls each and every month, but each one not more than about a half hour. On these calls, we're going to share new, innovative thinking about customer experience. We hope you'll come back and join us each month and enjoy the journey. On today's call, I'm proud to have Max Israel join me as my co-presenter. Max is the CEO and founder of Customerville, a good all-around guy, and my boss. Max, you want to say a quick hello?
Hello, everybody. Glad to be here.
Wow, that was a good quick hello. Thank you, Max.
We only have 25 minutes, so my usual windy wind-up isn't going to play.
Today's topic of conversation is about some research that we have done about Asperger's and the connections between it and a condition that we're going to talk about today called mind blindness, and how these things scientifically relate back to survey fatigue. Before we get into the topic, though, I thought I would just take a moment to talk about the kind of the state of the state in terms of survey fatigue. And as you see on the next slide, it's rampant. I'll tell you a quick story. I was in Seattle last week for business for 3 days, traveling at a hotel, using a car service, eating in restaurants while I was away, and I got no less than 8 invitations to take surveys for those 3 days. It's everywhere, to the point where the media is making fun of it. It's in newspapers, it's on television shows, where the backlash is louder and clearer than ever before. Look at some of the numbers behind this. It's pretty staggering. Last year there was an approximation that there were about 20 billion invitations to survey just in the United States alone. This year, maybe double. Imagine 40 billion invitations.
Huge number. That's just huge.
It's out of control. People are getting deaf. They're getting tone deaf to these invitations that are coming across email and point of sale receipts and conversations with other people, and it's starting to ignore them. But more than just ignoring them, it's creating a negative impact on the companies that are sending them. It's hurting the brand, it's hurting what the brand stands for, and it's building a sense of skepticism across the entire business.
One of the good examples of that, Mark, is our friend Bill Maher, who is in the watercolor there. If anybody on the call hasn't seen Bill Maher's kind of ongoing shtick about just making really merciless fun of companies who relentlessly survey people, go on YouTube and take a look at it. It's not family friendly, some of his language, but it is pretty funny. A little too close to the nerve, wouldn't you say, Mark?
I would sure say. Max, let's take a look at this situation together. Why do you really think people don't like surveys? What are you seeing?
It's interesting because I think as an industry for years, we've had kind of a handful of common explanations, and they're not completely bad. People say things like they're too long, and there's some truth to that. For a long time, surveys have been too long. I think we all know that. There's poor user experience, especially on mobile devices. That's certainly true. And the public's just not generally interested in sharing feedback. I think the problem with these that we ran into, especially starting about 5 years ago, was that they just didn't seem intellectually rigorous. I mean, we're in an industry where our clients need feedback, and these answers felt to us, frankly, to be really intellectually lazy. And part of the problem with that was this, that you never hear people fatigue on face-to-face conversations. You never hear somebody say, I don't like conversations that take longer than 10 seconds. I never have them. Nobody ever says that. And so if that is the case, then why is it that as soon as we need to use some technology and scale this, why is it then suddenly we fall back on these excuses, which frankly just didn't make any sense. And so from our point of view, starting about 5 years ago, we really wanted to understand that if we wanted to have the best kind of feedback platform in the world, and that's for 13 years, that's been our goal, we really needed to look at some unconventional sources of research. One of them was this idea. What does successful feedback look like? What does a successful feedback interaction look like, right, Mark, but like between people? Yeah. And what's interesting about that is that if you take a look at what works between people, you start seeing some common threads. Let me show you a couple of examples just really quickly. What happens in a healthy face-to-face interaction between people? I think these are things we're all going to know. Imagine you're in a conversation with somebody. As we like to say, you're at a cocktail party and you meet a customer for the very first time. Many of you have seen our video on this thought exercise. What's happening there? Your customer is going to share their story with you. You meet this person by chance and they're sharing a story with you about their experience with your company. Think about what's happening. The sharer of the story is usually doing most of the talking, right? And the receiver of the story, the person on the other side, this is maybe you're actually doing a lot. You're not maybe doing most of the talking, but you're demonstrating empathy, you're using your body language, you're adjusting responses to meet an emotional level with this person. And what happens is the person who's sharing the story sees this in you, and they just reinvest in the conversation because they can tell you're really with them. Both sides leave the conversation feeling more invested in the relationship. And Mark, we've also seen what happens when this doesn't go well. So this is worth looking at. It's common sense, but it's worth looking at. What happens in an unhealthy face-to-face feedback encounter? The sharer of the story is still doing most of the talking, but we've all had this experience. Imagine, have you ever, been telling somebody a story, you've been sharing some information with them, you're trying to have a conversation, and you realize they're not really authentically listening. They're not really there. Their eyes aren't focused the right way. They're glancing at their watch or their smartphone or something. They're not meeting your emotional level. It feels odd. It feels inauthentic. And both sides leave the conversation feeling less invested in the relationship. So when you looked at these things, we really wanted to get to the root of it. And what it comes down to is this. This is kind of the core. If you really want to understand why we have this concept of survey fatigue, you have to understand why people fatigue in real interactions. And human feedback interactions fail when empathy fails. So what's interesting about this, and this is kind of the subject of our webinar, Mark, is this idea that it turns out that if you really want to understand these failures of empathy so you can make technology like surveys better, there are some good places to look. It turns out that there's a large population of people who struggle to empathize. They have a condition called Asperger's syndrome. People who have Asperger's syndrome can't always empathize, and it makes conversations hard for them. If you are having a conversation with someone who has Asperger's, it can feel a little bit off-putting. And for years, I think they tried to help people who suffer from Asperger's to train them to feel empathy. But really, the way the behavioral science has gone now, thanks in large part to this gentleman, Simon Baron-Cohen. Dr. Cohen is a behavioral scientist at the University of Cambridge. He coined this term mind blindness. He realized that what's really going on with people with Asperger's is that they have a hard time attributing mental states to others or attributing beliefs and desires to them. It was just hard for people with Asperger's to see the conversation through somebody else's eyes. And so over time, they've been very good at helping people with Asperger's do some really important things. They help them mimic social cues everybody on this call takes for granted. And take a look at these things, because this is really important. People with Asperger's don't lack for intelligence. In fact, if you look at the research, people with Asperger's are frequently significantly above average in intelligence. This kind of social construct we have of kind of the socially awkward cerebral person, that is part of what you're seeing here. And what's really interesting about this is how behavioral scientists and occupational therapists have shown people with Asperger's to do things like this. Look at these three things. Creating conversational context. Mark, I think maybe you could talk to our audience a little bit more about this later on down the line, but creating conversational context. Don't just blurt out a question. Walk up and kind of give a little context around why you're asking. People need that. Have the right physical reaction at the right time. If somebody's telling you a happy story, you should be smiling and nodding. If they're telling you an unhappy story, then there should be a different reaction, but people need that. If you're talking to somebody and you don't see those reactions, folks, if their reactions are just a little tiny bit off, you know that something's wrong. It's remarkable how sensitive we are. And knowing when to give control of the conversation back to the other person, particularly if they're angry. So what's interesting about this is these are three examples of how behavioral scientists, thanks in large part to the work of Dr. Baron-Cohen here, have been able to help people with Asperger's have more graceful, more productive, richer conversations, more prosperous conversations with people. And these are three examples of lessons in behavioral science that have found their way into our technology. We're known for this feedback ecosystem we build. Here, we're really talking about the surveys that we build for companies. And Mark, maybe you can show some examples of this later. Here's a funny fact, Mark. I don't know if you know this, but Simon Baron-Cohen, if that name sounds familiar, there's a little bit of irony at play here. The British humorist Sacha Baron Cohen, who made famous the famously mind-blind character Borat, is his cousin. Those two guys are cousins. So this is the big takeaway. It is a small world. This is kind of the big takeaway on this thing, that survey fatigue and unsuccessful human feedback have a lot in common. What they have in common is this idea that it's a failure to demonstrate empathy via non-verbal cues. But what's cool about this, and I think that's part of our coffee break takeaway today, is that they also share common solutions, replicating the non-verbal cues that people need to create engagement. If you understand that, then you can kind of get away from this very shallow layer of excuses that we make in our industry about survey fatigue, and you can make surveys that people want to participate in the same way that they want to engage in a long conversation or in a longer conversation. I'm not advocating long surveys. I want to be really clear. I'm not advocating long surveys, no more than I'm advocating long conversations. You have a short conversation, a medium, or a long one, depending on the right case, and that should feel graceful and normal. You can train the survey to do the same thing. I want to share a couple takeaways with our audience about this. Just to kind of drive this point home. The first is that our need for these nonverbal cues is hardwired. And I'm going to give you a couple of really fun little tests to do here that will wow your colleagues and kind of prove our point. Our need for these nonverbal cues, we've evolved over, they tell us 3 million years. So basically, if you go to the Museum of Natural History, they'll tell you that as a species, we've evolved over basically, they're saying now 3 million years. And for a very, very long time, for almost the entirety of that, meeting another human being out there in the jungle or the forest or the plains was actually a pretty dangerous proposition. For most of human history, you were actually pretty likely to meet your end at the hands of another human being, right? And so your ability to look at somebody and instantly understand based on these tiny little clues, right? What Malcolm Gladwell called thin slicing, your ability to thin slice and quickly see, is this person all right, right? That your survival depended on that. And so we become incredibly sensitive feedback devices. And if you just think about that, think about how sensitive you are. You know if somebody's lying. You may talk yourself out of it, but you usually know. If somebody's a meter away from you and you're having a conversation and their eyes kind of aren't focused on you, you know they're faking it, they're not really paying attention. Folks, the difference between the black parts of your eyes being focused on my face from a meter away or not is a fraction of a millimeter, and yet you're so sensitive, you know it. That's an important point, to know how sensitive people are to these things. But the second point, and we'll honor this with a photo of I guess this is a retirement photo of Charles Darwin when he'd grown that big bushy beard. This is what I want you to know about those incredibly fine-tuned instincts you have that work for you in a conversation. You can't turn them off. It is very difficult for us to turn them off. You subconsciously judge authenticity. That is an instinct you can't turn off. Conventional surveys fail to respond in human ways. And what they're doing is they're asking for engagement while they're missing a whole host of social cues that you would never dream of ignoring in a face-to-face conversation. And what's interesting about this is that even though we're consciously aware that we're interacting with a brand survey and not the humans behind it, we subconsciously judge them. You can't turn that off. So I'm going to give you a test we call the black tooth test. The black tooth test is really, really important because it shows how difficult it is to turn these things off. Find a colleague, find somebody you really respect and admire who's super smart, and I want you to have this person pretend that they are missing a tooth. Take a black piece of paper and cover one of your front teeth. I've also seen people do this with mascara and eye pencil, eyeliner. Don't use a marker pen. That's not going to be a good idea. But use something you can fake and cover one of their teeth with black paper or eyeliner pencil or something. And sit there and talk about anything. Talk about something that has to do with work. And as this person talks, you will find that you cannot avoid discounting what they're saying. And then you'll shake your head and you'll say, no, I'm talking to Mark Mandel. He's a super smart guy. He's very, very smart. And so clearly he's smart. I'm just seeing this missing tooth. And he'll start talking, and after 10 seconds, you will start discounting and questioning everything he says. That is how hardwired you are. And what we want you to know is even though your customer knows, even though a customer out there knows, they're taking a survey. They're not really talking to you. They can't help but judge you if you fail to hit all those cues. Mark, before we hand this back to you, I want to show you something to illustrate this point. You may recognize, this is the American actor Ed Holmes. I love this guy. He's a really good actor. He's also a very funny guy, and I really liked him in the Hangover movies. In one of those movies, he lost a tooth. It turns out that he had a crown he really didn't like, and so they removed that crown, and it wasn't CGI. He actually acted this thing with a missing tooth. And so we've got a before and after photo. Take a look at this. Imagine this guy telling you anything, explaining you anything. Now imagine this. This is the same guy 24 hours later. Nothing's changed. He's still smart, still good looking, but he's missing a tooth. Before, after. You have a deep part of your wiring that is making you discount what he says and think of him as less intelligent, less genuine, less heaven knows what, because he's missing that tooth. And this is just an illustration to show you how incredibly potent and hardwired your social instincts are.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it is. Why don't we look at some kind of practical examples? What are some kind of good ways to look at this, Mark?
Sure. So, but before we look at some examples, I may have to illuminate some of the realities that many of us are faced with today. When I think of most of those 8 or 9 invitations that I took all the surveys from last week when I was in Seattle, this example here is an illustration that I've seen all too often. This is the state of the state these days on web surveys. It comes across looking very tabular in nature. It's very disembodied. It's not a human connection. There's no empathy here. There's certainly little, if any, context. The questions are pre-established and set up in a rigid sequence. It's a speech that I need to poke my head in and respond to from time to time. There's very little dialogue. There's very little conversation. And frankly, there's absolutely no empathy. I would imagine, Max, there's got to be a better way to approach these types of feedback mechanisms than this. Now, I'm going to start off by sharing 3 must-considers. I'm going to call them must-considers. Things that if I were a practitioner today that I must consider right out of the gate to make sure that my voice of the customer program is being as effective as we can make it. Before I get into that, though, I'm going to share just a quick point of view, a quick explanation that there is some secret sauce we're going to take a look at together as it relates to customer bill. And the secret sauce is really to do this right really requires, it's almost like 3 distinct ingredients in the cookbook that need to come together to make the magic work. There's definitely a distinct amount of design. You'll see on the screen in front of you a typical customer-ville survey. There's a beautiful design element to this type of display, more so than the one we looked at a moment ago. There's also a sense of behavioral science and the ability to link these things, link the conversation back and forth and react to it like Max was talking about a minute ago. We'll talk more about that over the next couple of minutes. And then finally, there's a distinct element of enabling technology, some really amazing world-class technology to bring together the confluence of design and behavior in one. To make the point clear about what we really need to consider, rather than sharing a sense of facts and figures and data points here for the sake of time, I thought I would tell you a really quick story. So imagine if you and I are old friends who haven't seen one another in a while, and we both coincidentally are visiting Seattle, let's say, and run into one another on a street corner. Maybe we give one another a wave when we see each other, hello, or maybe just a knowing glance, maybe a handshake or hug. Maybe we go in, grab a beer or coffee and catch up. This, my friends, is the basis of human communication. Whether this is spoken words or just gestures or look or body language and physiology, we establish context, we develop a connection, look for trust, and share openly. So, with that said, I ask myself, why are surveys entitled to be so different? Why are they designed to be more interrogative, like the bad example we saw a moment ago? with just as like an interview with a litany of questions that never seem to end, never seem to go away, and frankly don't flex or adapt based on what it is I'm sharing with you. Why can't it be like two friends connecting on a street corner?
That's
So
actually Mark, one of the things that if you think back on what Dr. Baron Cohen counsels and advises that therapists do when helping people with Asperger's is give that conversational context. Don't just blurt out your question. It takes 2 seconds, but people do it every time. Give a little context and make that human connection, and then ask.
that's a great point. So, the best surveys, like Max, like you just said, try to establish that connection in that context. They seek to connect people. They seek to be able to create two-way conversational dialogue, just like you or I might when we're meeting up on a street corner. So, Max, if we look at the next slide, it's an interesting dynamic now. Now we have these two guys that got together and they met up on this street corner, and they're starting to catch up. They're going for a walk. As I said, they're going to get a beer, and they're catching up with one another. And they're telling stories about where they've been over the last number of years, what they've been up to. Sometimes the stories are great and exciting and good news, new children born, new job promotions, winning the lottery for all it mattered. Sometimes they're bad stories. Sometimes people are ill or they have a bad situation professionally or family-wise. And we, as the recipient of this information in this conversation, like Max said, if we're doing this thoughtfully, we need to react. We react with our body language. We react with our face. We react in our conversational tone. We react in the words. And your survey needs to be able to do the same. And using a Customerville example, just imagine this screen where we're asking this feedback about being accurate and objective. Imagine, however, if that feedback came back and said, I don't agree, we did not achieve that vision, not at all. The imagery would have to change, right? If you're going to truly humanize this experience, we need to change the images. We need to change the color scheme. We need to change the presentation of the information. And frankly, we need to break the flow of the questioning to make sure that we stop in our tracks and really try to get some understanding of what's really going on here.
Mark, think about how that wouldn't work. I mean, think about how bad that would feel if you were telling somebody a happy story in your example about, a new job or something's going well, and then you turn to your friend you've met and you start telling them a story about something that went bad, that's not good. If your friend kept smiling and nodding, wouldn't that just be weird?
I would have to walk away.
But something, and we're so dialed into that. The example you're seeing here, this is one of many, many, many ways that we do this, but that's right. The photos, if the answers were unhappy, the photos desaturate and turn black and white, if I remember this example correctly. But you're right, those things have to offer, we're mimicking that change that a person needs to see based on whether they think something went well or not, because you need that.
Absolutely. Let's go to the next slide for a minute, Max, and kind of bring this whole point home. One of the other attributes, I think, of a really thoughtful program is the ability to relinquish control in the conversation. Like Max talked about, people who are challenged with some of these conditions sometimes try to over-dominate a conversation or be the only speaker in the conversation. Imagine now if you're getting that feedback back from your customer and the customer says, time out, we had a problem here, we need to talk about this. It would be pointless, to Max's point a minute ago, to continue on with the survey. Why don't you put your hand up and say, hey, I hear what you're saying, there's something going on here. Why don't we talk about the problem that you're faced with and not worry about the rest of the survey, unless you really want to continue on, but give the choice and give the control to the responding user of the survey. Give them the opportunity to break away from the pattern and say, here's what happened, and here's why I'm happy with you, or here's why I'm mad at you.
You can see a lot of things at play here. That's exactly what's happening. As you move left to right, you can see the customer had a not good experience, but it's doing, you would see it on the next screen. It's saying, hey, look, it looks like something's very wrong. Do you want to finish the survey? You'll still be able to tell us later. You just want to stop and tell me what happened right now. That's this idea you alluded to of knowing when to give back control of the conversation. It's a very human response, but also you're showing a picture of someone who's important and in charge with a warm, smiling face, making eye contact. There's a half dozen behavioral science concepts in play with this survey. And if you see it all animated together, it's really very powerful. It feels very human.
That's terrific. So Max, let's take a look at the next slide together. When I look at, since we've talked a little bit about some examples of bringing a human element and a behavioral sciences element into your Voice of the Customer program, we try to embody these things in kind of 4 key pillars of some of the best practices for some of the world-class programs that are out there.
The pillars of design-driven feedback. I love these.
Absolutely, that's such a crucial term. These best programs are really fundamentally about trust. They're grounded in storytelling. It's a conversation. It's an emotional journey that people are on. The process needs to, inspire and be creative, and frankly, not be a one-size-fits-all program. It needs to really consider innovation and bring information like access design-driven feedback to the process on a regular and consistent basis. So I asked myself a question, Max, on the next slide of what if I were a practitioner could I do Monday morning of next week? What are the key things that I need to consider next week, next month, next quarter, but as soon as possible to create some of this groundswell of success? So I put together 3 of and a couple of don'ts. Really quickly, the goal here is to make sure that you're always mapping your conversation to a human flow. What does it feel like as a conversation, not an interrogation? Leverage design and technology that mimic those nonverbal cues. Be frank and set context to why you're asking and frankly what you're going to do with it, and always think about it from a human point of view. This is not about a data collection exercise. At the end of the day, if you can do that and those 4 things really well, you will have a tremendous program in your hands. So I know we're almost out of time, but we have one surprise to share with you. Max has asked to share a little bit of a sneak preview, a sneak peek about some things that Customerville is doing to even raise the game even higher than the topics that we talked about there. So Max, do you want to share with us for just a moment some of the new innovation that we're working on?
Sure, absolutely, I'll do that. And I guess what I'd ask everybody to bear in mind is we're showing you some very primitive art that actually came from the patent application. One of the things we want to do is show you kind of where we're headed in terms of areas of new survey methodologies that we're developing. We are relentless innovators. We are just merciless on that. We want to be absolutely the most interactive, most engaging, the very edge of innovation. And so what we're showing you now is something you probably won't see in the market until kind of mid-2017. This is a concept called story survey. And imagine, if you will, we've given you a bank example here. Imagine a white screen, a blank screen that says, today I went to my branch, and as I walked in, the employees, and you kind of have something that fans out where you can finish the sentence, right? And what's happening in the background is you would either see a pencil illustration lightly illustrating in the framework of what you were seeing as a customer, or we've kind of experimented with watercolors or photo collages, but it's not complete. And as you finish the sentence, they gave me a warm welcome as I approach, or they were gossiping among themselves or whatever. Then it finishes the illustration, and it kind of moves, you flow through the screens, and it's starting the phrases. And as you finish them, it's beautifully illustrating back. It raises the hair on the back of your neck is what it does, because it just feels like, wow, this is really what happened. They really get it. And of course, another day we'll talk about the back-end infrastructure of how we distribute this information, but we're ascribing statistical answers to these. It's just a really good example of just a care and precision and quality that we put into building our platform that lets us deploy these amazing surveys for some of the best brands in the world. Especially as we start seeing in mobile, we start seeing higher and higher bandwidths. You'll start seeing this out there, and the next time you see it, you'll know we built it.
That's pretty cool. So Max, I know we're right up at the half hour, so we want to be able to make sure that the folks on the call know how to reach us. So I wanted to make sure that you had, obviously our phone number, but encourage you to visit our website. Our website is rich with information, videos, papers, a lot of content up there worth taking, and it's all free for the taking. So please come visit customerville.com and help yourself. Shoot us an email if you'd like to talk further. Give us a call if you'd like to talk further. We're here for you no matter what. Thank you very much, and Max, thank you very much for co-presenting this interesting topic with us today.
It's been a pleasure.
Take care, everybody, and thank you very much. We'll see you in a month.